Welcome into episode 230 of the Skate Podcast. I'm Brian D. Felice, joined by Bridget Prue and Scott McLaughlin. Bridget and Scott, it's been, 30 days since the Bruins last played, or between games? It's been quite a while. So I know, Scott, you were at Warrior Arena this week, and what's the latest going on with the Bruins?
Well, they have new lines. Bridget, do you want to start with that, or?
Yeah, I will start. So my opening shift has a lot to do with the new line combinations. Scott, you tweeted them out from practice yesterday. Really, there's quite a bit of movement, more than I was expecting. Like, I was kind of expecting them just to purely swap Poitras for Coyle, but they did more than that. So they moved DeBrusk to the left side on the same line with Zacha and Pastrnak. And then Marchand, Poitras, Geekie, which I want to get into that line a little bit more. And then Van Riemsdyk, Coyle, Frederick, and then the normal fourth line of Lucci, Beecher, Lauko. And so I have no issue with the first line combination, DeBrusk and Pastrnak and Zacha. I think they'd be fine together. I was intrigued by the fact that they dropped Van Riemsdyk as well as Coyle off of their original lines to align with Frederick, as well as decided Geekie would be elevated to the second line with Marchand as well, which is something that we haven't really seen. So that would be something where chemistry would need to get built. And I want to hear Scott's opinion on what that looked like in practice. I know it's probably a small sample size that you saw, but maybe some thoughts on why Geekie makes sense on the right wing, on a line with Marchand and Poitras. So I'm not entirely convinced that this is the best shakeup of the players. To be honest, and I've been saying it, want to see Marchand with Poitras, but I was happier with DeBrusk on that line as well. So what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Bridget with the longest opening shift of all time.
No. How dare you, Scott? You definitely hold the record. Don't even.
But we weren't calling them opening shifts then, so it doesn't even count. I think you can see the reasoning in all these lines. Poitras and Geekie have worked pretty well together in the third line, I think. So I understand keeping them together and then upgrading the other wing to Marchand. We talked about it. Like, it kind of serves two purposes here. One is that Marchand Coyle DeBrusk line was being used in sort of like a shutdown role, and they were doing a very good job defending and not giving up chances. They weren't getting a ton of chances at the other end. So Jim Montgomery kind of even alluded to this after practice when he was asked about the lines, and mentioned that Van Riemsdyk, Coyle, Frederick could be used as sort of a matchup line. And Coyle and Frederick played that role together basically all of last season. So we know that he can do it. Van Riemsdyk's, he's not going to be nominated for a Selke or anything, but he's been a responsible two-way player his whole career. Like, he's not a liability defensively. Meanwhile, Marchand and DeBrusk now both get freed up and put into a little bit more offensive situations. Poitras' playmaking ability gets, a clear upgrade with Marchand on his wing. So I see the reasoning behind all these lines. Part of me still feels like there's kind of one more shift to go, which would be sort of, I'm with you. Like, I thought the more natural change would have been just flipping Poitras and Coyle. But I wonder if part of that is you don't want Coyle to feel like it's a clear demotion just yet. So like, you still give him Van Riemsdyk, and it's like, hey, here's, a career-long top six forward and scorer, so that line can still be expected to produce offensively. But it does feel like eventually, a third line of Frederick, Coyle, Geekie, move Van Riemsdyk back up to the Zacha Pastrnak line, and then you go Marchand, Poitras, DeBrusk. Like, that still makes sense to me to end up there at some point, but I do kind of get, making this the first step.
Those are a couple of long back-to-back shifts there. No, just kidding. So did you want my 2 cents on that, or do you want me to go to mine? Yeah, I mean, I think, Scott, to your point, if we're massaging feelings here, it's not the right strategy. I mean, Charlie Coyle's 30 or 31 years old, so maybe even 32. I hope that's not the case, and really shouldn't be. So, I mean, other than that, I kind of echo what you guys said on that. I think it was kind of inevitable, I think, seeing Poitras move into those top 2 center roles. And yeah, I think, naturally switching him and Coyle was probably the easiest. Maybe Montgomery's just trying to, again, tinker with his toys and see what he has, and why not, right? It's the first month of the season, and we talked about how the California trip might not be the toughest competition, but I mean, Anaheim beat Carolina the other night, and the Kings are pretty good, and everybody's trying to play their best hockey in October, so you don't want to take any trip for granted. So I'm sure he's just trying to see what he has.
And maybe it's the kind of thing that they tried with Taylor Hall, like moving that kind of caliber guy to the third line. Van Riemsdyk being, the replacement there. And the other thing that maybe I'm not a huge fan of is, I know DeBrusk can play both sides and he's versatile like that, but he's been playing mostly on the right side the last few seasons, and I feel like that's probably his more comfortable side. So moving him to the left to keep Pastrnak on the right for that top new version of the top line is, that could be a little bit of an adjustment for him at first, because he's moving back over to the left where he'd been playing a lot at the right.
Yeah, it's interesting because for years it seemed like DeBrusk wasn't really comfortable playing on the right. He would get flipped over every now and then, and it wouldn't really go all that well, and he would end up back on the left. And now, basically since the second half of the 21-22 season, when he first got moved up with Bergeron and Marchand, he's been almost exclusively a right winger. So you're talking, a full season, like almost a season and a half at this point. So it has been a while since, I'm sure he's had shifts here and there on the left side. But it has been a while since he's played there regularly. My feeling is it's kind of like riding a bike. If you've been a left wing your whole life, I don't think you forget how to play left wing, but there could be a little bit of an adjustment. And as for the sort of like massaging Coyle's feelings, I just wonder if that's part of it. I also think there's hockey reasons to line up this way, where, if you want to get more rush chances from a Zacha Pastrnak line, DeBrusk is going to help you do that more than Van Riemsdyk, who, was a really good skater in his prime, but has certainly lost a little bit of foot speed now that he's in his mid-30s. Putting Geeky with Marchand and Poitras gives that line some size, and kind of another forechecking presence, which DeBrusk is a good forechecker too, but that does become a smaller line if it's Marchand, Poitras, DeBrusk. And then the scoring threat on the third line that you just mentioned, Bridget, like last year they loved having Taylor Hall there as someone who can help create offense. And Van Riemsdyk's obviously a very different kind of player. He's not going to be creating offense with speed, pushing D back, being a playmaker, but he can help create offense by being a presence around the net, which we've certainly already seen on the power play, but he can do 5-on-5 as well.
So, Scott, did you have an opening take yourself?
Yeah, so just another thing that, of note from Monday's practice, Danton Heinen's still here. He was still out there for practice, still does not have a contract. So I know, people are kind of wondering about that situation, why he hasn't been signed yet, why he's still hanging around. Jim Montgomery, I think it was late last week when he was asked about Heinen, basically said, like, we've asked him to be patient, and he has been. I think clearly they're waiting for something, and it could be this 9-game Poitras extended tryout. It's possible they're trying to wait that out before they, that way, okay, what does the roster look like with Poitras? What does it look like without? You kind of wait to make a final decision, because if like you could look at it as if you end up sending Poitras back, then Patrick Brown, who's also still with the team, probably doesn't get sent down, and you just sign Heinen and add him. If Poitras does stick around, then I think Heinen still signs. Like, I think the reason he's still around is because I think they have, sort of a handshake deal that he's going to be signed either way. But then you have to make, a corresponding move, whether it's sending Brown down, whether it's some sort of trade. So I think it's just for like the clarity of what exactly is the roster going to look like after 9 games. But, it is obviously a little bit weird because it's like he could get hurt in practice at any moment. And now all of a sudden he's kind of screwed. You would hope maybe like the Bruins still try to find a way to take care of him if that did happen. But, for him, I'm sure he's waiting around because there probably isn't anything better out there. He likes the situation. He probably knows he has a spot. So it makes sense for him from his perspective to hang around too. Where it would get interesting is if another team did come calling and offer him a real contract, that would sort of force the Bruins' hand to, basically either sign him or don't.
Sorry, turn my mic off. I think that I'm glad you kind of mentioned the timeline, right? Because we thought the timeline was to start the season, and it turns out that the timeline has extended beyond that. And then I think a lot of people were wondering, okay, then when? Like, is this going to happen? And like, why not? Why hasn't it happened yet? And that, though I do agree that's probably what they are waiting for, I'm not 100% sure why it's necessary, because I think it's easy enough to just send Brown down and to insert Heinen right now. And yeah, I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't do that. So I think that that's probably what's going to happen inevitably anyway. I mean, at least in my opinion, Heinen is the better option there than Brown. I do think so I don't know if you guys had the chance to watch any of the latest Behind the B. There's 2 episodes from this season. And they showed some of the conversation that was going on with Don Sweeney and the rest of the staff on their decision-making process and keeping Poitras and, waiving other players and to keep Poitras around. And it did sound like they very seriously were considering the 9 games being that's it. But I feel like as Poitras continues to do what he's been doing, that chance gets slimmer and slimmer by the day that he's going to be sent down. So at some point in the next few games, even if it's before the 9 games, the understanding is that he's going to stick around. I feel like maybe Heinen could get signed quicker in that situation, but truthfully, the logic behind it is a little bit lost on me.
I mean, who would you guys say has been the most impactful center for them through 2 games? Would you say it's been Poitras?
Yes, certainly at 5-on-5. If you wanted to like add in Coyle's penalty killing or whatever, but 5-on-5, I'd say it's pretty clearly Poitras.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he should be sticking around. I mean, as for Heinen, I just think you can never have too much depth as long as you can fit it under the cap. And I think, he's not a centerman, right? So that's where, Patrick Brown, it's like, you have that 13th type forward who's a center. But yeah, I mean, I like Heinen. I like what he brings to the table as a low risk depth forward that you're going to need throughout the course of a season. If it's not him, it's, somebody from Providence you got to call up. And obviously he's an NHL player. So it's surprising to me that he's not, doesn't really have teams calling him, for a middle 6 role, because, teams are in different phases of their development as an organization. But if it comes down to the player's preference, then there you go. So yeah, I mean, I think clearly he's sticking around because there's a handshake agreement in place, and I think he'll be part of this team going forward in a depth capacity. So for me, and I'll throw it to you guys quickly. I mean, the one thing that comes to my mind, and we were just talking about Poitras, but my question is just, say he ends up becoming one of your top 2 centers for the rest of this season, and he scores between, I don't know, call it 35, 50 points as a 19-year-old. How does that change the Bruins' approach going forward as it pertains to addressing high-end centermen outside the organization via trade or free agency? Do the Bruins view Zacha and Poitras as, like they're our number 1 and number 2 centers, and Charlie Coyle is our 3 center until he no longer is? Like, I just wonder if Poitras has the season that we all think he might kind of have. And I don't think 35 points is, I mean, that's a hell of a season for a 19-year-old, but I think it just seems like it's within reach for him on a low end. So call it 40 points. How does that change the Bruins' perspective? Like, you always want to improve your team, but obviously Zacha's locked up for a little bit here, and he's only 24, 25 years old. Poitras 19. I mean, is it one of those situations where
26? I think Pavel Zacha's 26, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, he might be, and but in any event, same range, and not in his peak in his prime yet. But would the Bruins view Zacha and Poitras as like good 1 and 2 centers down the line, but neither one's elite? Like, then they still want to try to get an elite player. Like, what does Poitras turn into? So obviously you can't predict the future, years ahead, but that's why I'm saying, like, say this year comes and goes and Poitras's like a 40-point, 50-point player, and you have Zacha there, and like, just how does that change their mindset?
Well, so that's a great transition into our mailbag, because that is pretty much exactly one of the questions that we got. So let's just start with that one. So I'll read it off for you. We got this one on Twitter, and the username was @ChurlyBoy on Twitter, and it says, if Poitras and Zacha prove this season that they can be legit top 6 centers, how does that change 2024 free agency? Imagining they re-sign DeBrusk, Swayman, and have Lohrei in their top 4 defensemen, they'd have good money to upgrade either defense or winger. So I think, Brian, that's pretty much what you were asking, and we can give our thoughts on that.
Yeah, if Zacha and Poitras prove to be legitimate 1-2 centers, it's huge. Like, it solves so many issues for the Bruins and really allows them to build out a team elsewhere. Like, all last season we talked about this tremendous depth they had, especially up front, and especially on the wing where you have like a Taylor Hall in the 3rd line. Well, you can start getting back towards that kind of depth if you don't have to go spend big money on a center next summer, or trade assets for a number 1 center this season or whenever. Like, it really opens up your options, because Poitras signed up for under $1 million for, if he does stick around this year and start his entry-level contract 2 more years after this. Zacha's 4.5 or 3 more years after this. So that would be really cheap down the middle and allow you to really allocate some resources elsewhere. And I think it would probably be on the wing. Like, if you look ahead a little bit to the free agent class this summer, and this will, it's always going to change, because some of these guys will sign extensions during the season. But at the center position, it's kind of thin. Like, there's still Elias Lindholm there in Calgary. Obviously, Mark Scheifele has now already signed. And there's even been rumors that Lindholm might be working towards an extension with the Flames. So not even a guarantee he'll be there. The big name, if he ended up being available, would be Elias Pettersson out in Vancouver. But he's a restricted free agent. Canucks do still have some team control, and presumably would end up getting a long-term deal done with him. But until that's done, obviously you can't rule it out. And then after that, it's like, if you're talking about centers, I mean, Steven Stamkos might be there. There's been some rumblings that, like, he's not really happy with the fact that the Lightning have basically ignored his contract and told him, like, we'll talk about it after the season.
Wouldn't that be insane? Wouldn't that be crazy to have Steven Stamkos in this lineup?
Yeah, I do think he's probably better suited on the wing at this point in his career, but for a short-term solution if you're looking to make a big splash. There's going to be a lot more wings though, like possibly William Nylander, who's obviously going to get big money. But then even after that, guys like Sam Reinhart, Jake Gensel, Jordan Eberle, Tyler Bertuzzi will be back in the market. Jason Zucker, Teuvo Teravainen, Adam Enrique, who's still a good player even though he's in his mid-30s. If you were looking more for upside, there's like an Anthony Mantha. There's just more options at the wing if you're, if you can go play in that pool in free agency and not be so bound to, well, we have to find a center, one way or another, whether it's big money free agency or giving up a lot of collateral in a trade. Like, if you can just sort of be in the market for wings instead, it would be huge. Obviously, we have a ways to go, right? Like, we're 2 games into Zacha and Poitras trying to prove themselves as centers. So, ways to go, but yes, it would solve a lot.
Yeah, and I would say that it's not just 2024 free agency, like talking about the offseason. If you're in a position to be buyers at the trade deadline, some of these moves could be made in season. And pretty much all of those wingers that you listed, Scott, are players that perk everyone's ears up because those are really good players. They're not going to come cheap, most of them, like Teravainen, no way. He's coming cheap, Nylander either, but those are all such big name players that have been with their teams for so long. People probably haven't even thought of them as options to add to their teams, but now all of a sudden it becomes a possibility. So there's going to be a lot of people in the market for those guys as well. It's not going to be like, oh, we're the only person targeting these people. They're going to have offers, and that's going to drive up the prices as well. So the funny thing is, when I read this question, the very first thought I had was Tyler Bertuzzi coming back. And I think a lot of people wanted him to sign here to start the season, but because he only signed that 1-year deal with Toronto, he's going to be available again. And you could get him at the deadline again as a rental or add him in free agency, because it sounded like he had interest in signing with Boston, but there was some sort of miscommunication or mishandled contract situation. Maybe that was on him. Maybe that was on his agent. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know exactly what the situation was, but he liked playing here. So he could be someone that they haven't forgotten about and they could go after again. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of options. So adding someone like him back isn't the only way to go. I mean, we know what he brings. We know he brings his net front skills on the power play. We know what he brings 5-on-5 as well. A little bit of that pest attitude, the same way, a little kind of like Marchand. But then you have those other options like Teravainen, that's more of a skilled winger. And then like you just mentioned, a lot of those guys play very different styles. So those could all be options for them, either in free agency or maybe even before that.
Yeah, but just quickly note on Bertuzzi, it almost certainly wouldn't be as a rental just because I don't expect Toronto to be selling, but
that is true. And neither is Carolina. So
if Toronto, we have a question about Toronto later that we'll get to, but if they don't start playing defense, maybe maybe they will be out of it. But
so yeah, look, I think this is the fact that this question is even being asked and we have the opportunity to answer it is something that I don't want to take for granted, because about a month and a half ago, Matt Poitras was not on anybody's radar. The Bruins having a top 2 center of the future outside of Zacha potentially was not on anybody's radar. And I want to express why that's so important, because for 15 years and 20 years for Bergeron, right? Maybe even 17 years, Bergeron and Krejci were together. The Boston Bruins had one of the best 1-2 combinations up the middle in the entire National Hockey League for almost two full decades. And they're both Boston Bruins Hall of Famers. They're both all centennial players for the Bruins, as Scott's well aware of. But neither one of those players ever eclipsed 80 points in a season their entire career. Neither one of them was ever a point-per-game player in the regular season their entire career. The reason I say this is not to bash what they've done. I mean, I'm their biggest fans. What I'm saying is the Bruins are in need of a number 1 and a number 2 center on their team. They're not in need of the number 1 center in the league, right? Like Patrice Bergeron was on the Bruins, and he was certainly the one of the best two-way forwards of his generation, and at all times one of the top two-way centers in the game. But he always played in a league with Stamkos, Crosby, McDavid, Matthews. Like he always had guys around him at his position that offensively were elite, where he was just a notch below them offensively, but his defensive game was insane. So all I'm trying to say is, like, we don't need Poitras and Zacha to be 80-plus point scorers if they want to be number 1, number 2 centers of the Bruins. They need to be responsible two-way forwards that can put up 50 to 70 points, because, I mean, that's what Bergeron and Krejci did offensively. They averaged probably around 70 points, 65 points a year. And it was good enough to make the Bruins the best at that position for almost 20 years in the league. So if Poitras and Zacha, not that they have to be Bergeron and Krejci, but if they can be two-way responsible players that are capable of scoring around 60 points a year, 60 to 70, then that's the formula that the Bruins had for 20 years, where you can build around those pieces. Now, one could argue the Bruins didn't win as much as they should have, so maybe there's something to be said about having a true, like, top player in the world. But guess what? Only 1 or 2 teams in the league can have that Connor McDavid, Connor Bedard type player. So I think that this is the big if. And then, Scott, you mentioned it's only been 2 games, but if Poitras and if Zacha, if you can see the writing on the wall that those 2 players can be 55 to 75 point players in this league at 19 years old and 26 years old, as Bridget mentioned earlier, then I think, I don't think you need to go out and get an Elias Lindholm, because how much better is Elias Lindholm right now than Matt Poitras in 2-3 years? So it's a huge development for them. And, you always want to improve your team. And if there's a deal to be made out there, always you want to explore it. But I think the Bruins potentially could just be in a position where they may have found their replacements for Bergeron and Krejci a year after them retiring.
Yeah, and let's stick with Scott, did you have something to say about that?
Just the last thing I was going to touch on was the D part of that. So, I think, because at Shirley Boy, which is just a great Twitter handle, no idea what it means, but mentioned Lohrei in the top 4. And I think, like, we all expect that, to also be a thing by next season. Lohrei probably going to be in the NHL at some point this year. And certainly if he moves his way into a top 4 role for next year, then however you decide to line it up, like, you're all set there with McAvoy, Lindholm, Carlo, Lohrei. If Lohrei's development goes the way we expect this year, that's a great top 4. And then you can fill in your third pairing really however you want, because Forbort's contract is up at the end of the season. Grzelcyk is up at the end of the season. Shattenkirk only signed a 1-year deal. So whether it's bringing any of those guys back or going in a new direction, you would also have flexibility on defense too. And, I think, like, they could spend a little bigger if they, wanted to try to really strengthen their defense. Or you can fill in your third pairing really just however you see fit. Like, if you want an offensive guy in there somewhere, you can go find one. If you want some toughness, like, you can get that. So they should have some flexibility on defense as well. Without the need to, like, spend huge, which is a real luxury for Don Sweeney to have, which, to have the money to spend to fill in your roster without having to, like, overcommit or desperately stretch yourself for one of the real top players on the market.
Yeah, basically, if you don't have to spend for a top 6 forward or a top 4 defenseman, then you're putting yourself in a good position to not have to spend a lot of money. And I think those roles, if you consider Jake DeBrusk, if we just put him in the category of re-signing, obviously things are different. You might need a top 6 forward if he doesn't. But if he does, then you have all those spots locked up, and the money you have to spend is much less. So I want to we had a few questions about Poitras, so I just want to hit those first. So the next mailbag question is, let's see, which Poitras question do we want? So this one is more of like a logistic one. I think we can answer this pretty quickly. Question from Jim that left this comment on YouTube. He said, are there any options for Poitras if the Bruins keep him past the 10-game limit, but then he hits a rookie wall in February and March? So I can answer this. Scott, I know you can answer this as well.
Yeah. First off, shout out to Jim because he's one of my friends. So
Jim left us like 7 questions.
Yeah, I know.
Jim, I don't know if we're getting to all of them, but we'll definitely get to this one.
Yeah, so appreciate Jim filling up our mailbag. But yeah, so for Poitras, yeah, they can send him back to juniors after the 10 games too. The reason that 9-game timetable is important is because once he plays his 10th game, the first year of his entry level contract starts. And that burns that year off his entry level deal, no matter what happens after that. So if you keep him for a 10th game and then he sucks the next 5 and you send him down after 14 games, well, the first year of his ELC is still gone. So you would still only have 2 years of control after. So that's why that 9 games matters. But they could send him back to juniors after later in the season at some point, and you could call him back up. So like they could send him down after 20 games and he plays 2 months down there and he's just tearing it up, and they have, they decide, hey, you know what? We need him back. Like, we could really use him in our lineup. They could then bring him back up some point later in the season. So it's similar to how you can call a player up and down from Providence, except in Poitras' case, it's not Providence. It's going to be the Guelph Storm in the OHL.
And there's a real disincentive to do that because you don't want to burn that first contract year. So I don't think they're going to need to have this discussion because I think he's going to stay. I have a really hard time imagining him going back down at this point. And I think everybody here agrees with that. It's
a good question by Jim, though, just for people who are wondering. And also, while we're giving shout outs, I also want to thank my mom for sending us the question about Poitras and the Bruins.
Yeah. Did your girlfriend send one too?
Is your mom at Shirley Boy?
Yeah, I told her to change that tag. I was like, Mom, people are gonna know what is that. She's like, don't worry about it. It's my alias.
Yeah, it's just an alias. So our other question about Poitras, and this one I had been thinking about, like ever since I read this question, I kind of was thinking about it. We have an email that Scott received from Scott, who listens to our podcast out in Seattle. So thank you, Scott. He said, do you think Monty will give Poitras a shot on the first line with Pastrnak and JVR, or possibly a Marchand Poitras Pasta line? And I've been thinking about it, and Scott, our viewer Scott, not this Scott, likes the idea because of the comparison between Poitras and Krejci, and how well Pastrnak has worked with Krejci over the years. Maybe try and see if the chemistry exists between Poitras and Pasta, which is just fun to say also. So I'd been thinking about it a lot, and I really do think give this a period or two of trial. If we're already throwing the lines in the blender like it looked like at practice, I want to see what it looks like.
Yeah, I certainly think you could see it at some point, especially if Poitras sticks around past 9 games. I don't think there's any rush because I think they like Zacha and Pasternak's chemistry together going back to last season. I think even though Montgomery's already changing that line, I think that's been a pretty good line so far. So, yeah, it could happen at some point. Obviously, we did see Poitras with Pastrnak a little bit in the preseason, or I'm trying to think. Did he get a game? I know he got some practices there. I don't remember if he actually played a game there, but
I think, Scott, you might remember, but I think they also got some time together in the Nashville game because of all the special teams. I think there may have been a few 5-on-5 shifts after
actually,
penalty
I think you're
kills.
right.
And I think it may have been Geeky with them. I think, or Lucic. No, Geeky. I think it was Geeky and Pasternak. I don't remember, but they did get a couple 5-on-5 shifts together.
I do not foresee a Lucci Patra pasta line happening at any point, but
certainly not with any consistency. But he was trying to. Montgomery was just trying to get some people on the ice that were on the bench during the penalty kills.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that was the combo because I think those are the three guys who weren't used at all on special teams. So he threw them out there for a shift right after. But yeah, certainly you can see how Patra's playmaking combines with Pasternak to form a good tandem. There can be a lot of, tryouts and moving things around because this whole forward group is not as settled as last year. There's not, a Bergeron and Marchand who always play together, or Krejci and Pasternak who have chemistry. Like, these are all relatively new combinations and different wings with different centers. So, yeah, if Zach and Pasternak are, they're a little bit slow for a while and not really producing, sure, you could see that. I also think, it's interesting because I think right now when you look at like the lines that they broke out Monday in practice, DeBrusk, Zacha, Pasternak kind of feels like the clear, quote unquote number one line. But I think if you end up in that situation where it's like, now you're going to put Poitras with Pasternak and maybe it's Marchand and Zacha, it's fine to like not have a clear number one. Like, I don't, even if Poitras ends up in that situation, I don't know that he's going to suddenly be playing 20 minutes a night like a number one center. You can still kind of manage his shifts and keep it, 5-on-5, second power play, and, sort of manage him a little bit that way and like not dump too heavy of a workload on him.
I do think it's funny, and I keep thinking of this, but I kind of feel like he's already reverted back on this. But Montgomery said he wanted to make fewer line changes this season, like tamper with the lines less this season, because he wanted to create chemistry because there wasn't a set, situation. He was going to try to build it by keeping people together. But first of all, I don't think he's going to end up doing that. And second of all, I don't think it's the right thing to do when you especially are in this window of trying Poitras wherever you can possibly try him to see whether or not he's somebody that you want to keep and where he might fit best. I think it makes sense to keep rotating and changing and checking. And so far, they've won the first two games. They have these opportunities on this road trip against teams that you're not going to get fit in the rear end as much if you're kind of tampering a little bit. So I think that this road trip is a perfect time to try something like that. So maybe we see Poitras play with Pasternak a little bit on this 4-game road trip out west.
I definitely think there's a happy medium to it. I mean, you certainly can't have a team with, what seems like half the forwards are new to this team and just run with the same lines. I mean, you got to see what you have. But at the same time, you can't see if anybody has chemistry if you're constantly changing lines every game. So I think in a perfect situation, you want to run with some lines to see what you have and then give them, 20 games together, whatever. But there's always injuries, right? The other thing you don't want to have happen is have everybody so used to playing with their specific line mates that, God forbid there's injury, which happens all the time, or you just need to shake things up in the playoffs or whatever, and guys don't have chemistry together. Like I liked the fact that last year the Bruins forwards seemed to have chemistry with everybody else in the forward group because they all played together at one point or another throughout the regular season for injuries or performance. And so it's good that if something happens, guys have familiarity with their teammates, no matter what. But where Montgomery ran into trouble last year was just, in the playoffs, just literally going away from what he did all. He just got to the playoffs and just, changed everything from what was working. It wasn't. And I know post deadline there were some personnel changes, and then there was injuries, and it was not as black and white as I'm making it appear. But throughout the regular season, I have no issue working with what you have, see what sticks to get you, into the playoffs and get you a win on any given night. It's when you get to the postseason, you want to be a little bit more consistent if things are working.
Okay, and there was a second part to Scott from Seattle's question, which also I had been thinking about, which is thoughts on these D pairings. McAvoy Lindholm as the top pairing, a second pairing of Carlo Lohrei, and then a third pairing of Shattenkirk Forbort. Would that be something that you could run with? Obviously, Grzelcyk is the one left out of that equation. So I think the main question revolves around the Carlo Lohrei pairing and what we think of that, because we did get to see that in preseason. Scott, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, and the other thing that Scott included there was he says trade Grzelcyk for draft capital that can be used for a depth piece at the trade deadline if when the Bees are ready for a run. I certainly think Lohrei Carlo could end up being a pairing. To me, Lohrei fits either place in the top four, whether it's next to McAvoy and you keep Lindholm Carlo together, or next to Carlo and you load up Lindholm and McAvoy in the top pair. Those both work for me. Like putting him next to Carlo, where that could really help is Carlo can really be the security blanket, and Lohrei can get involved offensively, which is his strength, and maybe take some more chances where he doesn't, he knows Carlo's going to be back there covering. If it's with McAvoy, then that requires, as we see with Grzelcyk and McAvoy, where they both have to be aware of what the other one's doing. And, there's going to be times where they're both jumping into the offense, and that's great because it adds to your attack. But you have to be aware when the situation calls for you to be the one to stay back. So I think both are options, and certainly could be options this year. So to the second part of it about, potentially trading Grzelcyk, like I've said before, I am in absolutely no rush to trade away my depth on defense, because every season you inevitably have to tap into that depth at some point. Last year that stretch where the Bruins went like 2 months with the exact same D core and Jacob Zaboral was just a healthy scratch every game. Like that's the outlier. That almost never happens. So, whether it's Grzelcyk rotating in and out of the lineup with Forbort or Shattenkirk, or like however it shakes out, I do think we're going to see Lohrei at some point. It's just what are the circumstances that lead to it? Is it an injury to someone, which is the most obvious one, or is it that he's just playing so well in Providence that he forces their hand? Does someone in Boston struggle? Like any or all of those could lead to Lohrei coming up, and I do think once he's here, it's probably in the top four. Like not that he couldn't play next to, say, Kevin Shattenkirk, but I don't think that's the ideal role for him.
So I agree with you, Scott. I'm in no rush to deplete the Bruins' depth on defense. And obviously you mentioned last year was a bit of an anomaly with the health that they had. But I also think back to April of 2017 when, you had Torrey Krug, I think, was out. Adam McQuaid went down. Colin Miller went down. I think the Bruins were down 4 of their top 6 defensemen that year in that first round against Ottawa. So you always want depth, and yeah, like for the 2022 or 2023, 2024 Bruins, I'm in no rush to, like you said, get rid of Grzelcyk. But where you have to consider it is that I believe he's a UFA after this season. Is that correct? So you would potentially be at risk of losing him to free agency for nothing if you decide to hold on to him and value that depth this year. So I guess it's just a matter of if Lohrei comes up and he's in a top 4 role and your third pair is Grzelcyk and Shattenkirk or Forbort and Shattenkirk or whatever, maybe there's a decision to be made based off of asset management while they're still, under contract. So that's the only thing. Aside from that, I have no issue with if Matt Grzelcyk is a or Mason Lohrei is your 7th defenseman on a given night, that's pretty damn good depth. So ideally, they're both in the lineup at the same time. Like my ideal combination would be a top 4 of, McAvoy, Lindholm, Lohrei, and Carlo, and then your third D pair is Grzelcyk and Shattenkirk. I think that's your most skilled top 6 that you can put out there on any given night, even right now, though Lohrei's in Providence. So anyway, I would echo Scott's sentiment. Don't want to trade him, but if it comes down to losing him for nothing, and you feel like Lohrei is a significant piece and whatever, you have to make a hard decision potentially. So how would you guys respond to losing him for potentially nothing in the offseason?
Well, actually, I will react to that secondly, but first of all, I just want to say, as a pair, Carlo Lohrei is just a massive pair. So Carlo is 6'5" and Lohrei is 6'4". And whenever I stand next to either of them, I feel like just a tiny little kid. And so when we did get a chance to see them together in the preseason, they took up a lot of space. They have a lot of reach. They have, neither of them are the fastest defensemen, but they're not that slow either. So you have a little bit of speed there, and you have guys that are just massive. And Carlo is obviously more of the shutdown kind of guy. He's going to be relied upon, and he's a veteran now, so he knows when he may need to recover for someone like Lohrei, who's still learning the system or still learning when to drop and when to pinch and different things like that. So I actually really liked the look that they had in preseason, and I could see that being a successful pairing for them. And I personally would like to get a chance to see it. But something that Scott mentioned is that if you're going to bring Lohrei up, you're going to bring him up for a large amount of time. You're not just going to stunt his development and keep him as your 7th defenseman. You're going to want him to continue his development. So you got to really make that decision that you're going to give him real minutes if you do bring him up. So that would mean that you're either having Grzelcyk or Forbort or Shattenkirk as your 7th defenseman in that case. And then Ian Mitchell would be out of the picture. Maybe he clears waivers and goes to Providence. Maybe he gets picked up on waivers. I guess that's the question. So Brian, to your question about Grzelcyk, letting him go for nothing is obviously not ideal, but we saw this situation last season when the Bruins were really, truly the top contender, and they didn't want to sacrifice depth on defense for any reason. I think that if they're in that position, that they really think that they have a chance to make a decent run at that point in the year, they may do the same thing and not sacrifice it. Because if at that point, say Grzelcyk is your 7th defenseman and Ian Mitchell got picked up on waivers, you are really shorthanded in terms of depth there, unless you're going to bank on Zaboral coming in and being a playoff defenseman for you. So I think it's a big risk to trade him at the deadline. And it all depends on how the season goes up till that point.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
This is Scott's flu game. He's been battling it for the last couple of days.
Yeah, this is brutal. Sorry, listeners. But yeah, that's exactly the key is how is the season going? Because if you're in it and you look like a contender and you feel, like you're right in the mix, then I'm not worried about potentially losing Grzelcyk for nothing, because I'm just worried about what gives me my best team this season. If you're more on the fringe, then maybe you entertain the idea of, sell-offs. You're not going to go full selling, but hey, if Grzelcyk's kind of the 7th guy, or we feel comfortable playing 6 guys ahead of him, then maybe you look at trading him, because you're not quite all in, and you might want to recoup some of that draft capital, because hey, look, next year they're still really short on draft capital. So if that's the case, if they're kind of like on the bubble in out, then sure, you entertain that and see what's out there. If you're first or second in the division come February, then you're just adding and you're trying to make a run this year. And if there's a hockey trade involving Grzelcyk, maybe it upgrades your wing or something. That makes sense. But otherwise, like I'm not going to trade him just to try to get something in return if I think that keeping Grzelcyk helps make us a better team heading down the stretch.
And actually, that perfectly transitions into a question that we got from Griffin, who wanted to propose a trade that would involve sending Grzelcyk or Forbort. So it said thoughts on a potential trade for Connor Garland. Let's say Grzelcyk or Forbort plus a little bit more for Garland at $1 to $2 million retained, plus Jack Rathbone. This is a complex trade that's being proposed, but so, and then the idea to call up Lohrei. So I don't know how much you guys have looked into Connor Garland or what he could help with at the trade deadline compared to the benefit of having that defensive depth.
Yeah, so here's just some cliff notes on Connor Garland, so people kind of have a better idea here. Well, one, he's local, he's from Scituate. Two, he's 27 years old, signed for this year and 2 more at $4.95 million a year. Has really good 5-on-5 scoring numbers and is a good two-way player as a wing. Over the last 3 seasons, he is 53rd in the NHL in 5-on-5 points per 60 minutes. And if you want to get an idea of what that range is, here are the names around him: Nazem Kadri, Sidney Crosby, Clayton Keller, Patrice Bergeron, Connor Garland, Chandler Stevenson, Elias Lindholm, Matt Barzal, Evgeny Malkin. Obviously, I'm not saying his all-around game is on the level of those guys, but on a 5-on-5 rate scoring basis, that's the company that he's in. He doesn't play much on either special teams, so you're kind of exclusively bringing him in as a 5-on-5 player. But if we're talking about potentially the Bruins looking to upgrade at wing, say James Van Riemsdyk doesn't stick in the top 6 or isn't producing like a top 6 forward, or Morgan Geekie doesn't stick. It's easy to see how the Bruins could be looking for an upgrade on the wing. I think Garland would be a good target. He is available. The Canucks have made that very clear. They want to free up salary, and he's been sort of the clear name on the trading block for a while. Elliot Friedman, just within the last couple of days, reported that the Columbus Blue Jackets, Nashville Predators, and Winnipeg Jets are among the teams that have shown interest. But trades are always hard to make early. Vancouver, I think, would want to make this trade as soon as possible. But trades are always hard to make early in the season because teams don't have much cap space and they just set their opening night roster. And most teams kind of want to see how that looks for a while before they start wheeling and dealing.
I mean, I like Garland a lot. I think he's a water bug. I think he works hard. He creates havoc. Scott mentioned where he kind of lays as far as his position in the league with 5-on-5. I mean, Scott mentions he's more of a 5-on-5 player. Well, so is Grzelcyk at this stage. And again, don't want to take away from the Bruins' depth, but this is a hockey trade, right? So if it was Grzelcyk, for example, this would only be as the question poses, if Lohrei was on the big club, right? So if he's on the team, he's top 4 making an impact. That's where this scenario is painted. So in that scenario, yeah, I think it's maybe you do, if you're bringing back Connor Garland, who's a really solid middle 6, second line, potentially first line player at times, and the cost is a couple of months of Grzelcyk, who, let's be honest, has not been a great playoff performer as it is, and then he's going to be a UFA, and I don't see the Bruins maybe re-signing Grzelcyk anyway if Lohrei's in their future plans. I just don't know if it's going to happen. So I think it's an interesting scenario, and I would probably, depending on how things are shaking out, if it's look, you always want to try to improve your hockey team, especially at the trade deadline if you're a playoff team. And if Mason Lohrei is in your top 4 and you haven't skipped a beat, and the cost is, Forbert or Grzelcyk, but you insert Connor Garland, I mean, I think you have to strongly consider it.
And so we have 2 more questions. This one I think could be a quick answer here, because this is something we're going to get to more as the season goes on. This is an email from Will. If the Bruins are a bubble team at midseason, would you move Ullmark for a 2C? Would he fetch more than a rental? And I think that is something that we need a little bit of time to answer still. And we did kind of just talk about whether or not they need a 2C. So just quick thoughts on this so that we have time to get to the last question.
Yeah, I think if you're the Bruins, first you as you said, like, you want to see if you feel like you already have your solutions in house. And I would say even if Zacha and Poitras aren't, as long as like they're having good seasons and you see an upward trajectory, I think that probably puts the Bruins in a position to still kind of continue to play the waiting game and, give those guys a chance. Now, if one of them struggles or Poitras gets sent back, maybe that becomes more of a possibility. It also all depends on what the market's going to be, because it's easy for us to sit here and say, like, well, if Linus Ullmark's having another really good year, you should be able to trade him for a second line center. It's like, okay, but that means you got to find a team out there that needs a goalie. If they're trading for Linus Ullmark, like, they're probably a contender or close to it. It's probably a playoff team. And is any playoff team parting with a second line center? So then it's like, are you getting a third team involved? Like, it gets really complicated really fast, because it's just not as simple as, hey, Linus Ullmark's playing well, let's go trade him for a center. If it was that simple, they might have done it this summer. So a lot of moving parts on that one for it to even potentially become a possibility.
Yeah, the timing of this proposal is where it's tricky, because Scott, you said it perfectly. Like, what team is trading for a number 1 goalie that's willing to give up a top 2 center? Like, you nailed it. It's likely a playoff team, right, or a contender, and that's just not something that makes a ton of sense, right? And chances are, if you're a playoff team, your goaltending has been decent enough to get you to that point. So it's really kind of an off-season move, in my opinion. I mean, you mentioned maybe they can get creative with a third party, but I don't know. I feel like if you were going to trade Linus Ullmark, and maybe they tried, right? But I think the general rule in sales is to sell when the asset's at its highest. And coming off of a Vezina Trophy performance, this past summer may have been the best opportunity for the Bruins to move Ullmark for the greatest return. And if it wasn't out there to be had, then they forewent it. So, but I don't see a scenario where a trade deadline move happens with Ullmark. Even for the Bruins, right? Like, I mean, is he that? I don't know. I would say I would lean no. And of course, we need to see, as we mentioned, like, does Poitras and Zacha fulfill what we think they could do? So it's ask me again in 3 months and 3-4 months, and we'll have maybe more of a specific answer. But even then, the scenario is still tough, because I don't know what team would want to trade for a number 1 goalie and give up an important asset in return. So
okay, I will get to our last one, and it was a comment on YouTube, which also had several comments beneath it in disagreement. So let me read it. It's John left this comment on YouTube for us. It says, "Can we all agree this current roster has no chance to win a Stanley Cup? Toronto will destroy this team." And that was met with some comments below it that were talking about how Toronto maybe isn't a better team on paper than the Bruins. So just thoughts on maybe how the Bruins stack up against Toronto, and this team on paper, this Bruins team on paper, a team that has a chance to make it past a team like Toronto and Carolina and make it to the Cup final.
Yeah, I certainly do not think we can all agree on that, John, because the Bruins still have enough to be a playoff team. And as we saw last year, if you're in the playoffs, you have a chance. And I think Toronto, we all picked them to win the division. So yes, on paper, I put them ahead of the Bruins, but their defense could really struggle. Like, they clearly took a step back defensively this offseason, where they lost a bunch of the depth that they had added last year because they had their own cap crunch. And their two big additions were John Klingberg and Tyler Bertuzzi, who do a lot of things that I like, but playing good defense is not among them. John Klingberg is an offense-first defenseman who has never been particularly great defensively. Tyler Bertuzzi barely plays defense. Like, you love a lot of the other stuff he does, but he is pretty weak in his own zone. So this is like the formula that Toronto had for years, where they had a ton of offense, but their defense and goaltending victimized them in the playoffs. It very well could be that same formula again for them. So no, I would not be conceding right now that Toronto's going to destroy them or anyone else in the playoffs, because they're a flawed team and they might be able to fix it, as the season goes on. But right now, no, like, that's a team with a pretty clear weakness.
Yeah, and as we learned last year with the Bruins, like, even teams that you feel like have no holes on paper, like, there are a lot of intangibles come April that play a factor. Expectations, outside noise, just there's a lot of reasons why you just can't. I mean, like Scott said, if you're a playoff team, there's a chance. I mean, the Bruins had such a better roster on paper than the Panthers did, and I would also say so did Toronto, and so did Carolina. But you know what? They had one player in Matthew Tkachuk who was just playing all world, and they had a hot month, and it got them to the Cup final. So I mean, I definitely think Boston's a playoff team. It's kind of two different points he's making. He's saying, can we agree that the Bruins aren't going to win the Cup? Well, okay, so put that off to the side, and then Toronto will kill them. It's two different things he's saying. I've never once seen Toronto beat Boston in the playoff series, and I think Boston has far better goaltending and defense. So while the Bruins certainly have question marks, I'm not going to sit here and put Toronto on a pedestal that they have not deserved yet. I mean, it's kind of like when you play Mario Kart back in the day, you see the three little guys on the things going to the top, and Toronto hasn't done anything. They haven't won a Grand Prix yet, Scott. So I don't know what this guy's talking about. But as far as the Stanley Cup prediction, I mean, like I said, what team can you point to right now that you can sit there and say for sure, like, yeah, they're going to win a Stanley Cup? Only one team can win, and chances are the team that wins the Cup has their flaws, because there's no perfect team out there. So I don't know. Let's just see what. I don't know, John. Let's see what happens here, buddy. I don't want to, damn the Bruins for being 2-0 right now, and there's a lot of promising things right now with them.
I wouldn't gamble on hockey. I mean, I don't gamble anyway, but I would not gamble on a Stanley Cup champion to start the season. I don't care what the odds are. I just think the Stanley Cup playoffs are one of the least predictable postseasons out of any of the major sports. It's just so up in the air. There's no definitive, this team can't make it or can. If you make the playoffs, you can win the Stanley Cup. So we've seen it happen before. And yeah, it definitely seems like a very strong statement that we don't agree with. And some of the other commenters, not commentators, don't agree with either. So that was our last question for the mailbag. Thank you to everyone for sending that stuff in. We got everything. We got emails. We got comments on Twitter. We got comments on YouTube. And if we didn't see yours, we apologize, but we will be doing more mailbags, especially when there's kind of a gap between games. So we'll be able to get to whatever you guys want to ask at some point when we do another mailbag episode. So, or, we don't even have to do it. We can just throw one of them into a random episode too. Doesn't matter if that's the main focus. But we do have a fashion segment Brian. I want to get your opinion on this because Brian is the lead fashion analyst here. Sorry, Scott.
Can I quickly throw out an answer to one of Jim's other questions? Because we definitely don't have time to answer all of his. Sorry, Jim. But he asked if we think there's any other rookies who could play in Boston. This doesn't have to be a long one, but I just made a quick list. If something happens to Swayman or Allmark and they have to miss time, Brendan Bussey's playing. I think Mark McLaughlin's pretty high towards the top of the list of call-ups, along with guys who aren't rookies, but Mark McLaughlin is technically still a rookie because he hasn't played enough NHL games yet. If they need a center and his development goes well this year, Georgi Merkulov could be a possibility. Fabian Lysell, we know had a disappointing camp in preseason. But hey, if he goes down and tears it up, like a second half call-up isn't totally out of the question. And on defense, just because we've seen years where you get down to your 8th, 9th, 10th defenseman, I think Mike Callahan looked like a player who wouldn't be out of place if you had to throw him into an NHL lineup for a couple games here or there. So that's my list of other potential rookies.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Yeah, I forgot to go back to all of those questions and check off maybe a few more of the 5 or 6 or 7 questions that we got. We can get to them at a different time. But anyway, we've already gone kind of long. And I made this beautiful fashion segment graphic. So let's do it. Brian, the jersey that we want to talk about is the Mighty Ducks looking Anaheim Ducks jersey. That is kind of like a maroon purple. And I think I know you well enough to know what your opinion on it is, but go ahead.
Yeah. It's the old jade and eggplant. I mean, look, I'm not going to hold back any punches here. I think it's the biggest travesty in sports that the Ducks have abandoned this look for the last, don't look now, but like 16, 17 years, whatever it's been. The Mighty Ducks, Disney sold the Mighty Ducks back in 2006, I want to say. And they just rebranded the team to the orange and black with the literally gross, disgusting, makes me want to vomit on my sneakers, Web D on their jersey. Well, Brian, why'd they go to orange and black? Oh, well, because they were trying to emulate Orange County, California, the pride of Anaheim, and it looks like shit. So I'm really glad that they went back to the old colors, and now it's just a matter of, I think to answer your question, Bridget, the jerseys look great. It's not the traditional logo, which, by the way, when Disney sold the Ducks in 2006, they also sold the logo. So for the longest time, I thought Disney sold the rights to that original logo. They don't. Like, when you sell the team, you sell all that stuff. So I think the team, if they wanted to, which is why you see it on their orange third jerseys, they can use that logo still. So the original Ducks logo isn't being used. It's kind of a hybrid Wild Wing logo, but nonetheless, I think they look sharp. The Ducks can easily go from the worst jerseys, I think, in all of sports to, a top 5 uniform in hockey if they just make that simple change and go back to their old colors. And right now, I think it's just a matter of time and a waiting game until that happens. I think it's probably going to be in the next couple of years. Hopefully they do that. But I'm glad that they went back to it. And side note, they are wearing those jerseys against the Bruins, because you bet your ass I went on their third jersey schedule on their website, and they are scheduled to wear those jerseys against the Bruins. So I'm looking forward to that one.
There you go. A reason to stay up late. I think that game's 8:30, right? So no, it's not even that late.
No, but the first one on Thursday is at 10:30. So
yeah, and so it's Saturday in LA. I mean, it's so like I actually think there's a way that orange could work for some team, because that is a pretty unique color in and of itself. Really, I think it's like Oilers use it as a third color, Flyers obviously, maybe someone else I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but the Ducks already had such great colors. Like, they already had such a unique color scheme with the purple and teal, or whatever what is it? Eggplant and
jade, Scott. Eggplant.
Yeah,
and
jade is the official color. Yeah, so that was already such a great color scheme. Like,
that's gonna be Brian's wedding color scheme. Eggplant and jade. Get the bridesmaids in the eggplant color dresses. And yeah.
And the only meal options are duck. So.
Oh no, no.
Mm-hmm. Yep, different variations of duck.
The only time I ever tried duck was this is a very random place and won't seem like the place to try it, but it was at a college hockey regional in Worcester. It was part of the media meal, and it was okay. It was okay. I can't. That was probably like 10 years ago, and I've never felt the need to have duck since then. But
maybe go to like France and try it. I don't know. This gotta be better place.
I mean, Worcester is the Paris of the Northeast. So
that's what they say.
Well, Scott, that sounds awful. I'm sorry you had to go through that. What's your final opinion on the jerseys?
I love them. Like, look, I wish it was the original logo with the sticks crossed and everything. It's sort of like the updated alternate logo of the duck-billed mask, which is the best part of the logo anyways. So still a very high grade. And if they ever just went back to this full time with the original logo, it's an A+. But I give these alternates a solid A, like 9.5 out of 10.
I knew as soon as I saw them, Brian was gonna have positive things to say about that jersey. So I think that's it. I concur. I like them. They got a lot going on in a good way. So I think that's it, guys. We are gonna drop another episode. So I don't know if we mentioned this before. We're gonna try to be more consistent with when we drop our episodes. So Mondays and Wednesdays are going to be good times for us to drop them. And then we all have different kind of crazy weekend schedules. So maybe that one's more up in the air because I work Fridays and Saturdays broadcasting, and Sundays Scott helps with Patriots coverage. And so that might be more up in the air, but Mondays and Wednesdays, we're going to try to be as consistent as possible with that. So I think, we'll get to our next podcast after Thursday's game. So I don't think we're going to want to record directly after because it's going to be like 1 a.m. So we'll try to get that up at some point Friday or Saturday, depending on when we record.
Yeah, I think in general, Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, look for them. Certainly Monday, Wednesday, and we'll try to do consistently on Fridays, whether we record on Thursdays or not. But that's probably the general schedule to look forward to. And as Bridget said, like the third one throughout the week might be subject to change, but it'll always be 3 a week, and certainly Mondays and Wednesdays they'll be dropping, and Fridays unless things change on a given week. So, all right, anything else from the two of you?
Nope.
All right, Bridget, great job with the little headers on the bottom. They look very nice.
I got creative yesterday.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. We will talk to you very soon. Hey guys, thanks for watching this Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.